Week of class, our second to last week of the official semester, which is kind of exciting. It's been a while since I did one of these, so I'm kind of glad to be back at it. I hope you all had a nice break and are ready to finish out the last couple of weeks of the semester strong. I did want to say just one thing. You can't really tell, but just in case some of you picked up on it, my office is in a little bit of a disarray this morning. One of the things that we do over Thanksgiving break is steam clean our entire house. So all of our bedroom furniture is moved into the office while that carpet is drying, and then all of the furniture that's in here will get moved in there later on in the afternoon. So I apologize for the clutter that's happening behind me. Okay, so I want to just dive right in. We are continuing our discussions of inequality this week, focusing on class. Some of this stuff at this point in the semester is probably going to be not all that surprising to you, or at least whenever you start to learn about the sociological perspective on class. So first, I want to say I'm going to post a clip that speaks to the extent to which America is stratified by class, which is quite significant, especially when you compare how stratified America is in comparison to other industrialized nations, other nations that are similar to the U.S. in terms of GDP. This is probably not news to many of you, but there are there's a small portion of our population that has a lot of money, a lot of wealth. There is a sizable portion that kind of has a moderate amount of income and wealth. And then there are, again, a great many people who have very little, right? This is what stratification is about. Now, class is important to think about, not only in terms of kind of what class stratification signifies in and of itself in terms of inequality, where certain groups have a lot of resources and other groups don't have very many resources, but class is one of those aspects of life that affects other areas of life. And the book does a really good job at talking about how class affects other areas of life in terms of life chances or life outcomes. McIntyre speaks about class as it relates to health and education, our working life, the criminal justice system. So she gives a really good sense of how class affects these other areas of life. So it really is this very key component to how our lives unfold and how our identities and interactions take shape. Make sure you pay close attention to that in the reading. There are a couple of ways to go about explaining social stratification, or explaining why it is that certain groups end up in certain classes. One of them is very common in society, but not all that sociological in nature. And the other one is less common, but more sociological. So I'll start with the first. So the cultural explanation for social stratification suggests that different classes have different values, beliefs, and behavioral norms that are passed down from one generation to the next, and that these values, beliefs, and norms are not compatible with success in American life. So that's why lower classes or working class groups don't experience upward mobility, because their values are not compatible with upward mobility in American life. Education is often emphasized in this explanation as something that working class groups don't value as similarly as middle class and upper class populations do, or classes do. So that's one explanation for social stratification, and I bet this resonates with a lot of you. I bet a lot of you that this sounds familiar, things that you've heard before. In contrast, sociologists tend to focus on more structural explanations for why people end up in different class groupings. So the idea here is that this unequal distribution of resources arise out of different access to opportunities. So the class that you're born into will afford you certain resources, certain opportunities, and those that are in the upper class or middle class, middle upper class, they have more resources and opportunities at their disposal as compared to people in lower classes or in the working class or underclass. And so that's why we see a lot of consistency between generations in terms of class outcomes. Because by and large, while there are certainly exceptions, the class that you are born into is, in terms of probability, the class that you will die in as well. So another thing to consider when it comes to this structural explanation of class stratification is that it suggests that differences in culture are a consequence of poverty, not a cause. So the cultural explanation of social stratification looks at culture as being an independent variable that is going to affect the outcome of your class status. The structural stratification kind of views that as the complete opposite, in that the class that you're born into is going to create those cultural values, and that may result in a cycle of poverty, but that first stems from this structural unequal distribution of resources and opportunities. Those that subscribe to the structural explanation of social stratification, again, this is one that's much more sociological in nature, tend to view cultural explanations, the one that I explained just a moment ago, as wrong and as damaging. That cultural explanation of social stratification in a lot of ways engages in a victim-blaming narrative. The reason why poor people are poor is because they deserve it, because they don't have the right values, is kind of what the structural critique is of that cultural explanation. Excuse me. Something else that I wanted to touch on in the video lecture is this idea of achievement ideology, or McIntosh refers to it as the fallacy of hard work. Achievement ideology is essentially the idea that anyone that works hard enough can succeed in America. And most of you, if not all of you, have probably heard this at one point or another in your life. It's a very common ethos or belief in our culture. It is probably the most prevalent cultural belief in American society. And you can see that this idea that anyone, if they work hard enough, if they make good decisions, they can achieve upward mobility in life. You can see how this is very closely related to the cultural explanation of social stratification. Side note, we had to move our cat trees in here, so there's Orbitz making his appearance. I know we haven't seen him for a few weeks. They're a little confused about why their cat trees are in the office and not the bedroom. Okay, back to the lecture. Sorry for that distraction. Okay, so what I was saying here is that this achievement ideology in a lot of ways works as a legitimating rationale. So a legitimating rationale is a belief system that justifies any system of inequality. We talked about the legitimating rationales associated with racism, with the patriarchy, even though we didn't necessarily call them that. Achievement ideology is what legitimates the class inequality we see in American society. Again, it goes back to this idea that poor people are poor because they deserve it. And every in a system of inequality has to have a belief system that supports it. Otherwise, it ceases to exist as a system of inequality. So we can think about the legitimating rationale of feudal England, for example. What kind of sustained that stratification system, that system of inequality, was the idea that everyone occupied their particular place in life. You were either nobility, cleric, landowners, peasants, because this was the will of God, right? Your place in life was preordained by God. And so you can see how that's a very powerful legitimating rationale that sustained that system of oppression for a very long time until people began to question it. So sociologists generally find this achievement ideology, this fallacy of hard work, as problematic for several reasons. First, even low-wage jobs are scarce, which is something that we read about a few weeks ago in our race unit whenever we read The Job Ghetto, right? People who want to work may not be able to. These low-wage jobs are scarce resources. Secondly, resources are not evenly distributed. So just to say that anybody can succeed in American life if they just make good decisions and work hard is really simplistic, because it's not taking into account the uneven playing field that exists in American society. Some people are going to have to work a whole heck of a lot harder than others in order to achieve success in American life, and achievement ideology in its simplest form doesn't account for that, or at least minimizes that unequal playing field. Lastly, something to consider here is that the structure of our society, the way we organize ourselves, does not allow for everyone to achieve, right? So I like to do this little mental experiment when I talk about this. Let's say our government stumbled upon this miraculous mineral or drug, we'll call it Achievacil, and what they found out is that if you put it in people's water, whenever they drink it, the next morning they wake up and they're just everybody is super ambitious, super hardworking, very intelligent, very bright. And so if we play this out, and let's say that we started all drinking that water today and we woke up tomorrow, we would still need people working in those low-wage jobs that are not rewarded in our society or don't have as much prestige associated with them as do occupations such as doctors and lawyers and professors. We need people to work in those lower-paying, less prestigious jobs, or we need people doing the dirty work, as sociologists who study work in organizations refer to it as. So lastly, before I move on, actually, I wanted to make this point. I know that in a lot of ways, me problematizing achievement ideology may not set well with some of you. And some of you may be inclined to say, well, yeah, but I know this person who started out working class and rose to great success. And we can point to many examples of individuals in our history who have been able to do just this. So I'm not necessarily saying that it's impossible to achieve upward mobility in American society. I'm just saying it's not a probability. It's a possibility, but not a probability, right? There's a difference between the two. So just keep that in mind. The last thing I wanted to mention is that, once again, something I've said already, most people do not experience intergenerational or intragenerational mobility. By and large, the class you're born in is the class that you are going to die in. But when we do see upward social mobility happening in American society, it has most often occurred as a result of social factors, not individual ones. So, for example, during the 70s and 80s, our economy transitioned to one that was more service-oriented rather than manufacturing-oriented, that rose wages or that caused wages to rise for a great many of people. A lot of people were also displaced from their positions due to outsourcing or deindustrialization. When immigration occurs, when immigrants enter our formal working economy, they tend to occupy those dirty work positions that I referred to before, pushing a lot of other people up in terms of wages, a lot of people, but not all people. And so again, when we look at the history of class in America, what we see is that the vast majority of upward mobility that's happened is as a result of social changes in our society, not because people are working hard at the individual level. Again, not to suggest that hard work doesn't mean anything. Okay, that's all that I have prepared for this week's video lecture. Make sure you view the clip that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and I will see you all next week whenever we finish up the semester by talking about global inequality. Have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Bye.